Many of you may already know about Longbarrow Press. You may not know about its publisher, but Brian Lewis is the editor and publisher of Longbarrow Press. It's a Sheffield-based collective whose activities include interdisciplinary collaborations and poetry walks. He's also an essayist, curator, and poet. His publications include East Wind, an account of a walk across the Holderness Peninsula, which I heard him talk about at a previous event that we ran, which was quite a trudge. And it's that sort of area of land that goes from Hull to Spurn Point, right on the sort of most easterly part of the East Yorkshire side there. And another title, White Thorns, which was based on a series of walks through the Isle of Axholme. I'm not sure where I know where Axholme is, Brian. Can you fill me in?
It's kind of between Doncaster, Scunthorpe, and Goole, in fact. So it's kind of triangulated. It's this kind of very flat and largely, undeveloped space, about 40 miles by 40 miles, and very apt for walking if you like wide horizons and flat landscapes.
Great. Okay, well, it's over to you. The floor is yours, sir, and we're going to hope that screen share works.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to everybody for joining us this evening. I shall now commence the screen share, so you won't be seeing much of my face over the next 20 minutes, but hopefully the images will make up for it. Right, let's start with the first slide.
Success. Go on.
Excellent, good. So Longbarrow Press was launched in Sheffield in 2006, and this orderly display of bespoke objects is drawn from our first 7 years of activity. I think if the press has an ethos or a spirit, it arises from this act of collective making. It's about craft, collaboration, and care, but it's also about chance, contingency, and constraint. In other words, it's about thinking on our feet. As with many new endeavours, though, it took us a little while to find our feet. I'd like to focus on an early project which seems pivotal in this respect. So this is Owlerton, or as it probably should be pronounced, Ollerton, in North Sheffield. It's a patchwork landscape of car showrooms, casinos and cemeteries in North Sheffield. An example perhaps of what Victor Hugo would describe as bastard countryside. It's the kind of scruffy, neglected corridor through which one would normally travel at speed, either exiting or entering the city, one of many conduits in this part of North Sheffield. The poet Matthew Clegg, who was living nearby at that time, spent summer 2007 walking these landscapes, taking different routes each day, exploring different aspects of this environment, and at the end of that summer he had 56 tanka. And if you're not familiar with tanka form, think of it as haiku with 2 extra lines. So this very, kind of formal, contained cycle of poems, but pushing at the edges of that formality and that constraint as well. He sent the poems through to me as his publisher, and we began to discuss possibilities for presentation, as it's a non-linear, non-narrative cycle of work. Those possibilities began to proliferate when we looked at the ways in which we could actually rearrange and resequence and represent the work. So what we ended up with was a pamphlet containing 50 poems, an audio CD, a set of postcards, a body of individual poems wrapped in plastic, which kind of resembled the things that one might find by these roadsides, and also a matchbox, which we can now see on the screen, which measures something like 2 inches by 6 feet, with all 56 poems concertinaed into this matchbox-sized box. And we thought of it as both a way of slowing down the reading process to something like walking pace, rather than having X number of poems to a page. Each poem occupied its own individual space, and it also became a very portable object, a body of work that one could actually walk with. The launch of Edgelands was similarly unconventional, if you like. We'd done quite a few events by this point, usually involving the back rooms of pubs, and we wanted to get away from that, if only briefly. So we devised a 4-hour walk to launch this new publication, and the walk took place amongst the landscapes in which the poems were actually set. Although it was mid-June, the weather was not entirely on our side. I think we had pretty much constant drizzle throughout the afternoon, but in spite of that, the audience stuck with it. And what we also saw was a democratization of matters. Normally, at conventional poetry reading, you've got the audience on one side, you've got the poet or the speaker on the other. Those boundaries began to break down, and just the collective act of walking made it a participatory and democratic experience. So the discussions, the dialogue that flowed between the readings felt like an entirely natural extension of the connections that were developing between us. So that publication and that event really began to catalyse and focus our practice, I think, at that particular time. By this point, we're getting into mid-2008, and what it did, I think, was open up the possibilities for the printed object. It opened up possibilities for public walks, poetry walks, again breaking down those barriers and opening up this kind of collective space, and also opened up the possibilities for what I would broadly describe as field work, which is to say making recordings in these spaces while walking, making short films, recording podcasts, and developing essays from all the material that was coming out of these spaces. So the next walk that we led was later that year in November 2008, this time co-led by Matthew Clegg and the poet Chris Jones. And it started in the centre of Sheffield, on the banks of the River Don, and followed the river north, very close to where we started the Edgelands walk earlier that year. And every member of the audience, which was somewhat expanded from that first poetry walk. I think the Rose, we had approximately 40 people turn up on the day, which briefly became something of a public safety concern, but we managed to get everybody safely to the end unscathed. And each member of the audience went away with this small poetry map containing poems by both poets, and a audio CD with the two poets reading poems along the banks of the river. The following year, Chris returned for another poetry walk, this time joined by the poet Andrew Hirst, and Sideways and Familiar was an attempt to decentre the city of Sheffield, or at least offer alternative histories, explore alternative routes, and in many cases that meant the audience funneling through these tiny back alleys, and kind of rarely explored ginnels, as we call them in Sheffield, which in this instance led to Paradise Square, which was the site of the reading that day. We can see Chris on the right addressing the audience and quite possibly contravening a bylaw which was laid down during the time of the Chartists, prohibiting public meetings in this and I think a few other spaces in Sheffield city centre. Fortunately, we weren't aware of that at the time, and it was, I think, a Sunday, so there were no local officials patrolling the space. So all this walking-related, walking-themed activity seemed to be leading somewhere. It was gathering momentum over the years, and one of the points to which it did lead was the publication of the walking-themed anthology The Footing, which appeared in late 2013. And this brought together the work of 7 poets, some of whom were based in Sheffield, a few of whom were based elsewhere. But what they did have in common was an interesting and creative range of responses to the invitation to develop new work on the theme of walking and landscape. So that in itself, as a publication, generated a whole new cycle of walks in and around and beyond Sheffield. And one such cycle was led by the poet Faye Musselwhite, pictured here at the start of the first of 3 walks that were presented under the title of Contraflow, so named because in each instance she was walking against the flow of the River Rivlin, where each of these walks took place. The Rivlin Valley in North Sheffield has this extraordinarily rich natural, cultural and industrial history, and for each of these 3 walks, which took place over 3 seasons, over 3 years between 2014 and 2016, she explored a different aspect of those histories, taking a different route each time. In the same year, the poet Chris Jones, pictured left, and I explored the churches of Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire, or rather 3 churches, with the aim of recording a series of podcasts in each of those spaces. And we're also joined by the artist and writer Emma Bolland, who took this photograph. Something that was interesting about our collective practice that day was how our roles subtly changed over the course of the day. So Emma had initially agreed to take photographs in each of these spaces, but after I think the first church visit became more and more drawn into dialogue with Chris. They were both very much engaged in the commentary on the pre-Reformation wall art, which was the focus of that particular excursion. So that became more and more pronounced in the 3 podcasts which developed in the ensuing period. We then returned to Sheffield for a walk led by the poet Angelina de Rosa and, not pictured here, Pete Green, who led this ascent of the city in May 2017. The idea was to explore the city's intersections and termini, mostly transport intersections, but also the city's ancient bridges. And Angelina is here seen at Victoria Quays, part of Sheffield's canal basin. This is, I think, about midway through the walk on a Sunday morning. What was interesting about this reading was that as soon as Angelina began reading the poem, she was accompanied by these extraordinary bells, this church tolling somewhere in the distance and filling the canal basin with this extraordinary resonance, and that kind of lasted for the duration of the reading. I was talking earlier about the importance of chants in these situations, and you couldn't possibly engineer something like that. But if you set up the dynamics, and somehow they can hopefully harmonise if you're lucky. So back to the printed page. This was the first of two books that we published in January 2019, each quite coincidentally with a focus on place and orientation. And this is a double-page spread from the collection Rock as Gloss by the poet Mark Goodwin. This is the second title that we'd published by Mark. The first Steps had appeared a few years previously, and that had a much more explicitly walking themed angle to it, I guess. But this was exploring, I guess, the layering of the landscape, and each publication with Mark is very much a collaboration with him in terms of design, and most of the poems in this collection had to be redesigned to fit the constraints of the printed page. But it was a very richly rewarding collective endeavour. Something about working with Mark is that you do encounter some very, distinctive approaches to layout. And I think that's certainly true with this spread here. And that kind of theme of orientation and mapping was also taken up by Nancy Gaffield in her collection Meridian, which was published in the same month. And Nancy describes Meridian as a poetic journal in which the shape of the poem is determined by the rhythm of walking. It's a book that draws on her experience of walking the 270-mile Greenwich Meridian Trail from the coast of East Sussex to the coast of East Yorkshire. It's a line drawn from one coast to another, and again, it was an extraordinary experience just laying out some of this work on the page and kind of really pushing it, the kind of finite boundaries or constraints to somehow evoke this kind of continuous line that was moving through it. We worked with Nancy again the following year on the Wheeldon project, which was a very different work, a collaboration with three musicians who, like Nancy, were also based in East Kent, and it was both a collective improvisation and a collective excursion through the landscapes of East Kent, its marshes, woodlands, and shingle, moving towards the open spaces of Dungeness, close to the easternmost tip of North Kent, and again you can see a glimpse of the page layout there, very much a kind of open form, evoking some of those landscapes that they were moving through. And this theme of collective walking was taken up again in our first night walk, which took several years to organise, I think, following the first discussion. But this is once again the River Don, seen very close to the end of the walk, which was led by four poets in January 2018, Chris Jones, Faye Musselwhite, Angelina De Rosa, and Pete Green. And we did, of course, manage to choose the coldest, wettest and darkest nights of the year. Anticipating this, we went for a much shorter walk than usual. I think it was somewhere between an hour and 90 minutes. You don't want to push the audience's limits too much. You want it to be an enjoyable experience as far as possible, not a test of endurance. But the setting, which was framed by a Victorian cemetery at one end and a industrial estate at the other, was something which I think kind of really focused the themes of the poems. It also kind of funneled us through this corridor, this space that was given the limited light, just about navigable. I think a few of us had head torches, but again it was an extraordinary immersive experience, one in which I think everybody kind of was able to participate fully as well. And and also led to, I think, the development of some new work. So this final slide shows the cover of Night Walks, and the photograph, again taken by Emma Bolland, shows, I think, some of the audience and a few of the poets towards the end of the walk. I think at this point we're just moving into the industrial space I mentioned. So in March 2020, at the start of the pandemic, Longbarrow Press created the first in a series of themed supplements, which are still available to download from our website. It was a means of turning some of our output into a free shareable resource, the distribution of which would be simple without barriers to access. But I also saw it as an opportunity to revisit certain themes and projects with a sharper focus. So the Nightwalks PDF brings together some of the poems from the 2018 event alongside Emma Bolland's photographs of the North Sheffield Nightwalk and an essay that both retraces the journey and examines some of the ideas and exchanges that contributed to its development. These digital pamphlets were, and I can probably come out of the screen share now. So in part it was an attempt to make use of and highlight virtual distribution networks. At the same time, the problem of physical distribution had become apparent at the onset of lockdown. Bookshops and other non-essential retail outlets had closed their doors, and the Postal Service was also struggling to cope. But there were no explicit restrictions around walking, so I was able to do what I've been doing for some years, delivering books by hand, on foot, throughout the city. Fast, reliable dispatch, and it also saved me a few quid on postage. Advertising the service on social media seemed to generate a few more orders to Sheffield addresses. On some days I'd walk for hours, making socially distanced book drops as far north as Chapeltown, and in the south to Totley and Bradway, close to the border with Derbyshire, the edge of the map. I also found myself documenting these walks in the form of a public journal. The following excerpt dates from the 21st of April 2020. I cut across the unnamed park that lies between Tesco on the Ponderosa and aim for the subway at Netherthorpe Road. I come out on the other side and take the short flight of steps that leads to the student flats off Upper Allen Street. There are construction or maintenance workers hauling cables out of a van, and strips of flame-retardant sheeting hanging from the sides of the buildings like sterile dressings. I wonder why I've taken this route, and then I remember where it leads. I cross Broad Lane to St George's Terrace, almost without looking. There is next to nothing coming off the roundabouts. The University District is left and right and front and centre. One day this will be a city-state, and Sheffield will collapse into the suburbs. Always the hunger for space. Every so often the map is redrawn. The institution expands in every direction. Today its machinery is suspended, and the only people I see, pausing or passing, are utility workers or taxi drivers. I walk down Regent Street between the Innovation Centre and the School of Health and turn left onto Pitt Street. At the end of the street I stop and take several steps back and look up at the pub. It is smaller than I remember. I think that I must think that every time. Through the decorative glass and the off-white curtains I can see that the lights are lit on the ground floor, though it is mid-afternoon and the pub is closed. I look up at the first floor windows. This is where Longbarrow Press was launched, on the 27th of April 2006, in the upstairs room of the Red Deer. So this diaristic mode helped me to structure my chance encounters with a city made strange. Furthermore, the linear framework, borrowed from the walks themselves, was sturdy enough to support the fragments of memoir embedded in the journal. This reflects the fact that when we are in motion, our thoughts are often elsewhere, even when we are absorbing the particulars of our surroundings. We can see similar processes at work in the idea of the day journal that informs Edgelands and Meridian, the sense of the quotidian and the ineffable meeting quite often in a single line of poetry. To quote W.S. Graham, the eye reads forward as the memory reads back. Or Rebecca Solnit, walking allows us to be in our bodies and in the world without being made busy by them. It leaves us free to think without being wholly lost in our thoughts. Over time, this walking journal also served as an unofficial, incomplete history of Longbarrow Press. But after 30 days and 17,000 words, I stopped. While I continued to deliver books throughout the city, I had no intention of writing out further lockdown walks. A year and a day after the first stay-at-home order was issued, however, the press had a flurry of sales, including several in South Sheffield. So the following day, I packaged up the orders and set out on foot. Hillsborough to Woodseats via the city centre and back through Greystones and Ranmore, a round trip of 6 hours. I returned with the notes I scribbled en route and a rough idea for a lockdown postscript of maybe 2,000 words. What I ended up with is a hybrid memoir in 42 sections that ran to 32,000 words and which took 2 years to finish. So some of this material has appeared on the Longbarrow blog, 2 pieces titled Last Collection and One Way Mirror. Those sections concern the city centre. The following excerpt from early in the walk directly precedes them. "3:50 p.m. I can't remember if DIY shops are permitted to open or not, or if they are half open, or if everything stops dead at the door. You'd have to know what it was that you wanted without knowing what there was. There is often a pallet left on the pavement outside Yorkshire Decorators Centre, flat to the asphalt or propped against a corner pilaster. It is not left there by mistake. It is a sign that a delivery has been made, emulsion or varnish, and that another is expected, primer or wood stain, at which point the empty pallet will be taken away. There are no pallets today. There won't always be pallets. I crossed the junction with Furnace Hill to the mixed residential and commercial building that appeared on the corner a few years ago. It is not much of a mix. It means that the ground floor is an estate agent and the rest is flats. The estate agent is House, H-A-U-S, stylised in lower case, logo projecting from dye black brick, text set in geometric sans, bright yellow fill, silhouette of a house embedded in the first letter. The staff are still working on the premises. They are here this afternoon. I can see them through the tinted windows. I wonder if any of the flats above the estate agent have been sold through the estate agent and if there's any daily interaction between the estate agent staff and the residents of the flats. I walk on, a trinity of Dutch gables overhead. A solid idea, the shops between them falling to bits. A blue car turns right from West Bar onto Lambert Street, a glimpse of Worrell Business Supplies, its sloping bays and indented signage. There really is nothing left to cling to. There are no reserves. It either gets used or it doesn't. I grew up in a working town that prospered as other towns and cities declined. The more it prospered, the more impoverished it looked. Fleet Street, Bridge Street, Regent Street. Everyone can see it coming, of course, so they stopped going into the centre. No one wanted to be there when it happened. Now the high streets are empty. and the arcades are shuttered. So what? The town isn't special. We knew this growing up. It was knocked into us. You would only hear Swindon mentioned as a punchline to a joke, the same joke over and over. Everyone knew what it meant. To stay meant failure, and choosing to stay meant that you had chosen failure. I chose to return, and I came to value its ordinary streets more and more. Things don't have to be outstanding or exceptional. They can be good and useful. They can be enough. I owe my life to that. I owe my life to the things that can't be easily spoken of, much less written about. A southern working-class background. I mean to speak or write it accurately and responsibly. To speak of class, if we speak of it, is to qualify it, at times defensively, at others apologetically, because class is never as simple as class. You can't think with it for long before it starts to slip. You can't confer it on yourself. You can't confer it on others. Don't think that I haven't tried. I passed the entrance of the National Emergency Services Museum, closed to the public, open to the street. There was a man in overalls, painting the red doors a redder red. I think of the Swindon Mechanics Institute, site of England's first lending library, a Grade 2 listed building left to rot by the local authority. I wonder how and when the expression working class made good came into use, and who would use it, as though your class was some inherent defect, an ancestral flaw. And to have made good is not to make good, of course. It is to leave something behind. It is to leave others behind. I pick my way across one set of traffic lights and then another, and then thread round the back of the prime development opportunity that leads to Silver Street and Paradise Street. The cobbles narrow to a distant slope, and the cathedral clock strikes 4. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brian. That was fantastic. And the reading was very good too. I really enjoyed that, and compelling stuff. And the good news is we've got some questions in the chat. So I'm going to, in a minute, just invite people to voice those. One of the things I want to impress upon people, which, unless you're a recipient or you purchase something from Longbarrow Press, you really don't get the quality. When you see the slides that Brian has shown you, you really don't get what these are quality publications. And what I find, I have to put my hand up when my first career, if you can be deemed to have a career, was I became rights manager for Hodder and Stoughton, which was one of the major adult trade publishers in the UK until it got swallowed up by someone else eventually. But one of my first jobs there was I worked in production, and I worked on jacket wrappers and book jackets and hardback books, and trying to do all sorts of things like repair ones which had been damaged. And the extraordinary thing I found that I would, before I met Brian and before I really knew about Longbarrow Press, I actually ordered a book, and it not only was a absolute delight to hold and read a hardback book, but Brian had, whoever it was, I didn't know at the time, but of course it was Brian, had wrapped it so carefully, so beautifully, that it would travel through the post and arrive. And it took me a little while to sort of open it, because each layer, I think he'd wrapped it about 3 or 4 times. So here's a man who has invested a huge amount of time and effort in producing fabulous books, and as we can discovered already, he's a pretty good writer himself. So Brian, thank you for the presentation. That's really good. Shall we do these in order? I think we will. Let's Catherine, do you want to ask your question? It's a very simple question, but do you want to ask it, Catherine? You just need to unmute yourself. may have disappeared. She was there. But okay, so Catherine asks, how is the name Longbarrow connected with Sheffield? I must say, Longbarrow, I'd normally think of the Wiltshire Downs or something Neolithic over there.
Well, it's a good question from Catherine, and you've actually gone halfway to answering it, Andrew, and that's it's not connecting with Sheffield. I kind of glossed over the origins of the press, but although the press was launched in Sheffield and I've been based in Sheffield for some years, as are many of the poets, I grew up in Swindon, and I was still based there for much of the time when the press developed. But I was in dialogue with a number of poets based in Sheffield. So I think it was another poet, in fact, Andrew Hirst, with whom I co-founded the press in 2006. We'd been, sort of pitching various possibilities at each other, none of which really stuck. And one of them was, I think I may have added Longbarrow Press to that list, and I didn't really think much of it. But Andrew suggested that we should actually adopt it. And if it lodged anywhere with me at some subconscious level, it was probably due to a school trip to the West Kennet Longbarrow in Wiltshire, which took place when I was about 10. And I didn't revisit that site for another 30 years or so, by which point Longbarrow had been active for about 7 years. But if it's taken on any kind of active meaning in the context of the press, maybe we think of the Longbarrow as a repository for certain objects, and maybe this is what the press has become over the last 17 years. But certainly for me, it's a very personal connection, wittingly or unwittingly, if that helps at all.
No, because I'm from Sheffield.
Right.
I was saying I just was puzzled because I don't recall Longbarrows. But then
No, there aren't many further north than, well, Wiltshire and Oxfordshire, I guess, actually. But it's a good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, over to you, Phil.
Yeah, Brian, are there particular places or spaces that recur in the work of the press as refrains do in poetry making?
It's a really interesting question because there's so many. I wouldn't describe them as small places, but certainly with working with a number of poets who are often kind of rewalking and reworking aspects of the city centre. There do seem to be quite a few aspects of the city of Sheffield. So, for example, Ladies Bridge, which I think is the oldest bridge in Sheffield, seems to have recurred through quite a few events and a few publications as well. Actually, I mean, this may have kind of limited resonance, I think, for people who aren't familiar with Sheffield, but it's been the starting point for at least 2 or possibly 3 poetry walks that I can think of over the years. It's also cropped up in a few poems, certainly one by the poet Rob Hindle, for example, and of course it crosses the River Don, which in itself makes repeat appearances throughout our publications, as it does throughout the city itself. Beyond Sheffield, I'd have to say probably Kinder Scout, which was the focus of the eponymous pamphlet, or near eponymous pamphlet, by Peter Riley, which came out in 2014, The Ascent of Kinder Scout, and also crops up in a few poems that developed as part of a collaboration with the artist Paul Evans, which kind of focused on various Peak District landscapes. So Kinder Scout in the Peak District was one of those. I can think of 2 or 3 poets who've responded to Kinder, one of whom, Faye Musselwhite, is with us this evening. Rob Hindle has also written a poem for Kinder, and again Peter Riley again. So yeah, that's certainly cropped up a few times as well.
Okay, so Anne to Forrest, not one question, but two.
Yes, well, I just this was amazing, and I was really struck at the beginning. What I started to think about was a symbiosis between walking and poetry, and what I didn't put in my chat because I wasn't sure how to quite articulate, but also how that spilled over into the form of how you were the media, the various media of how you present the poem that felt very much like responding to walking and the spirit of walking. But I was curious about how each had influenced the other. I mean, you talked about this somewhat, but especially how did being a poet shape your approach to walking, if you think that it did, and how did being a walker change how you wrote poetry?
That's a really interesting question. I think, without being too reductive in my response, I would have to say that for me, there's no poetry without walking. I mean, it just doesn't really happen without the stimuli of a walk, and often that's a long or longish walk, often in a landscape with which I'm only becoming acquainted. But equally, many of those landscapes, particularly in the Holderness Peninsula, anywhere east of Hull, really, heading out towards the east coast, quite often rewalking those has kind of generated further cycles of material, but the main drivers, I think, are firstly the walking, but also the experience of editing other poets, and two which should have been an enormous pleasure and I would say a privilege. There's something about working with other poets, and that kind of really close critical relationship that just gives you access to a very, very different perspective on work, particularly work as it's developing, of course, and which is, I think, pretty much unrepeatable, actually. So, but coming back to the idea of walking, it's something. I think there's something about kind of closing off all other distractions, and I mean, I don't want to attach too much significance to the fact that I don't have a smartphone. I kind of suspect if I did, then I might find it difficult to resist that particular element in space in the space through which I'm walking. On the other hand, I'll probably get better photographs. So it's it's a trade-off always. But there's something about the act of walking for me that makes makes walking pretty much the sole focus, really. So it does kind of privilege that act above everything else, and so whether I'm simply absorbing more information consciously or otherwise as I'm moving through that space, but it always seems to leave me with with a greater kind of richness of material, I guess, to draw upon, and not saying I could really kind of simulate in any other way, but I would also say that that any work that does develop is backed up by in addition to any notes I might make along the way, access to any amount of supplementary material, paper and digital maps, for example, and the kind and the kind of ad hoc research that many of us do when we become engaged in and enthused by the space, when we become curious about the space that we move through but don't really have the information to hand that might possibly allow us to interpret them. So, but it's always the walking driving the work, I think, rather than the other way around.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's really, that's very inspiring. Thanks.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Brian. That's great stuff. Quentin, you're up next.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Great. My question is, can you ever be an impartial observer on a walk, even if you're trying to be so?
That's a very interesting question, and for me, the short answer is probably no. to be, as truthful as possible, I would certainly say that it's possible to be a uninformed or less informed observer on the walk, and I certainly have been that walker on many occasions. Quite often, when I've gone out to a landscape with which I've been unfamiliar with, in some cases a hopelessly out of date map, on at least one occasion no map at all. But of course, you're never entirely uninformed. You're always drawing on whatever information you have, even if it's not particularly useful. And sometimes, of course, you can look at a landscape and, as I've often done, draw the wrong conclusions in terms of making any decisions about the direction in which you should be walking and where to go next. But yeah, the question of impartiality is an interesting one, and I think it's interesting for where it might lead in terms of how we read landscapes, how we might read the history of that particular landscape, how we might read the apparent uses of that landscape. Quite often I'll be looking at something, for example, a long, low shed in a flat landscape, and thinking, so is that some kind of, industrial farm? Is it being used as a storage silo for something else?
I think it's that thing of being able to imagine or come up with interesting things that aren't presupposed or known just by observing the thing. I'm just thinking really of my mum, who delighted in just walking around the cities of Europe without a clue.
Of course.
But absolutely loved the discovery of that.
Well, that's really interesting because of course that introduces the whether intendedly or otherwise, and to what extent this does frame our readings of landscapes. But also you've got the question of language, and your mother may have been a fluent speaker, or a fluent reader of those the languages of those countries.
Yeah,
but,
she was Latin languages she could just do. But she just used to delight in walking around, and it could be anywhere in the world. She would just kind of have a walk and just take the experience of the walk as a thing rather than reading a guidebook.
Absolutely.
She just felt it was a much more valid way of experience of being in the world for her.
It's really, really interesting, because often there's so much implied knowledge and so much expectation that we might bring to landscapes. For example, expecting certain things to be open between certain times, and the landscapes or the spaces of certain countries may have certain expectations attached to them in terms of if kind of signposts are painted a certain colour, for example, that might indicate one thing in one country and another thing in another, just to take one example. So and a lot of it comes back to this idea of to some extent defamiliarization, sometimes being a desirable thing in terms of seeking at least a degree of impartiality or innocence in the way that we read landscapes. It's a really interesting question, I think.
I think it just strikes me that we very often have set ways of thinking and understanding things, and sometimes they get in the way of seeing what's there and being in that moment, in that place, because you've got these perceptual filters.
Absolutely.
In place.
Absolutely.
Well, if I can jump in, this is sort of similar to what Don has asked as a question as well. And so, Don, let me ask you to sort of jump in and ask your question, because it's kind of similar, but an extra step on. But I'd just like to say to everyone, we've got about 5 minutes left. So if you have thought of a question and I'm not going to ask it, or yes, I will, I'll wait to the last moment. And the answer is you need to write it in the chat almost straight away. Anyway, Don, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Brian. This question relates to the last question about being an impartial observer, and also the filters we bring to either an experience of poetry or walking. And the question is, have environmental issues of the day colored your approach to walking and poetry? Because you can't, for me, I certainly can't escape the constant news about the biodiversity and climate crises, and I know that has certainly colored my approach in nature. So I just thought interesting in your thoughts on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's sometimes it's more to the fore, and sometimes it's in the background. But I'll start by acknowledging the extent to which it informs much of the work that we publish. So, for example, Nancy Gaffield's long poem Meridian, which is traversing a whole range of landscapes from the south coast of England to the east coast. So much of that long poem is coloured, or one might say troubled, by those considerations, and she's seeing it play out in so many different ways. For example, industrial farming. Having to skirt around all these, enormous agribusinesses, which are, particularly dominating the, county of Lincolnshire as well, having to make so many detours around, these, kind of vast industrial farms that in many cases have, kind of closed down footpaths or made them very, very difficult to access. All these monocultures, which are also fragmenting, habitats and, kind of further starving the resources of, the life that would otherwise depend on them. And of course, she's ending up on the coast of East Yorkshire, as I've done, as a walker many times, and seeing this, coast, this coastal landscape, which is eroding at an incredibly fast rate, and to some extent there's always been erosion on the Holderness coast, but that erosion has accelerated in recent years, and climate change is certainly a factor in that, by all accounts. And so we're actually seeing this loss of landscape in real time. But it crops up in certainly in Nancy's other work as well. The Wealden project, I think, was very closely informed by those concerns. It's certainly there in Mark Goodwin's work, I think, and yeah, as a walker, you couldn't help but you certainly couldn't be innocent of it. And again, it's the way that land use is changing. It's the way that so many habitats are being, endangered or eroded. Equally, the white thorn sequence, which I think Andrew mentioned at the start of the event, was set, as you mentioned, on the Isle of Axholme. So much of the focus of that is on the wind turbines, which are dominating that landscape, and it's kind of charting the transition from the kind of areas depletion of, or kind of exhaustion of fossil fuels, which many of which are buried just below the surface. There was a mine in or on the edge of that particular area near Doncaster. It's now been replaced by a solar farm. There are kind of wind farms in the local area as well. So whether that's a more hopeful sign, one would like to think so. But again, it's very interesting to see that transition, from one mode of energy to another. So that's something hopefully I'll be exploring in future work as well.
Okay, well done, Brian. You've come right to, you've timed it perfectly. We're just about at the end of the show, as they say. We're going to allow you to have the last word. But first of all, I'm just going to say a really big thank you. Really fascinating stuff. I really love the creative range in which you've put together some fantastic poetry editions, and the way you explored those sorts of things, and have told us a little bit more about what goes on for Longbarrow Press and for yourself. And thank you also to Emma and Faye, who I know have contributed to Longbarrow Press books, and you're both on the call. So thanks too for coming along. The last word, over to you, Brian. You have the last word.
Well, again, I'd just like to say thank you, Andrew, for hosting this event so expertly, and for managing the discussions so expertly as well. And thanks to everybody who's joined us this evening, and for the fascinating and stimulating questions that have developed as well. And I've really enjoyed taking part. So once again, thanks to everyone. Thank you.